have you ever heard yourself be introduced and be like, who's that? That's how I feel a lot of times, actually. So since we do have two audiences, just know that a lot of times I'll be talking to you, but I also might be talking to the students to make sure that they know that there's some information that they might need to know. So yes, my name is Cari, and I have been very fortunate to work in the field of preservation for about 30 years. And I came back to the University of Georgia to teach about 6 or 7 years ago. I feel like I'm one of those people that has multiple lives, like a cat. I've been working in private practice, I've been working for the federal government in public practice, and also in academia. But I think that really helps the students because I can kind of relate to what's going on in private practice or what's going on with the federal government or state government or local government. So today we're going to introduce you to what the University of Georgia Preservation Program is. It's a graduate program. However, we do have a number of certificates that allow undergraduates who are interested in historic preservation to get a certificate with either historic studies or cultural landscape studies. So you may have heard about this little institution up the road, the University of Georgia, one of the oldest chartered in the country, 1785, and with their motto of to learn to serve, they really do focus on, and it's an integral part of our natural environment, our cultural environment, try to make sure that we research, that we understand what it is, and preserve it into the future. So in case you are not aware of the College of Environment Design, in which the Historic Preservation Program is housed, we basically have been around since the 60s, and we started out with landscape architecture. We have an undergraduate degree in landscape architecture. We also now have a master's degree in landscape architecture. Just in the past a few years, we've created a Master of Environmental Planning and Design program. The Master of Historic Preservation program began in 1982. Courses actually were being taught from the early 70s, but the actual program developed in 1982 for a graduate program. And it was one of the earliest programs in the country. Very few, there was about 4 or 5 across the country, and it was one of the first ones, certainly the first one in Georgia. Now we have a couple of different programs in Georgia, one at Georgia State that is really meant for people who are working full-time, and they work during the day and so take courses in the evening. And there's also in Savannah, SCAD, that also has a historic preservation program that tends to focus more on architecture side of things. And I'll tell you a little bit about what the University of Georgia does here in just a moment. So our Master of Historic Preservation program, we really have a pretty broad mission, but if we were to summarize it, basically we want to prepare students for very broad-based careers in the field of preservation so that they can actually recognize opportunities to make a difference. And we're finding that a lot of the students that come in these days really do want to make a difference. They have been certainly exposed to environmental issues for a very long time, but a lot of people might be from rural areas or they hear their grandparents' stories, and they're aware of and sensitive to what historic places are, but they may not know quite what they can do about that. So what we try to do is offer them opportunities. Like I said, this is a graduate program, so it is meant to be an add-on. So if you have an interest as an undergrad in anthropology or archaeology or history, it could be science, it's really meant to take that base knowledge that you have and then add preservation to it so you can broaden your view. However, we're finding that many students in undergraduate really want to take certificates. I think it's in trying to prepare for what possible jobs could be out there. Many different students are getting certificates in all kinds of things. So we have operated to basically allow undergraduate students to get a certificate in historic studies, historic preservation studies, but then also graduate students can get, who are not in our degree program, if they are in another degree program, they can also get a historic preservation certificate at the graduate level. If they are interested in historic landscapes, we have a certificate also for historic landscapes. And we'll get into what those different things are in just a moment. So the program of study, I don't really expect you to be able to read this text, but I'm going to kind of go over how things have changed a little bit. When we talked about historic preservation, I would say back in the 60s when things were starting, and in the 70s, it was pretty much about architecture and archaeology, and that was pretty much all it was about. As times change, as we're realizing that we are this very diverse world, that there's a lot of things about cultural traditions, ethnic traditions, intangible traditions, that it's not just those buildings and those landscapes that are important, but it's about food, it's about language, it's about dance, it's about arts, it's all of this. So we try to expose our students to as much of that as possible. We of course start with, how do you survey buildings? How do you understand what the National Register is? We have different courses about preservation philosophy. We have preservation law. So all these foundational courses we absolutely have to have. But as time has gone by, we've also had to add a lot of different courses as either students have become interested, or the faculty have become more involved with international preservation. So we know that the students will be interested in those things. So we try to offer courses in a variety of things. So just a couple of the kinds of courses we offer. We have a course of graphics courses, building materials, so that we know how to address issues of weather or damage in certain ways, how different materials will react to things. If we're trying to put those buildings back together, what kind of mortar do you use? What kind of mortar don't you use? We also have things about planning. Much of preservation is about how does it work within zoning and planning and ordinances and things like that. So students have to understand what their role is and what role they can play in that process. Public participation is a very big part of that. Some of the other things we've done is site interpretation. It becomes very important. We can tell a story from one perspective, but it really engages people if you tell it from a number of perspectives. So we ask students to really think and question. We go to historic sites and we say, is this the way that it should be presented? Is there any other stories that we can tell about this place? And so we have these really interesting conversations. There is an international issues course that we teach. We also teach a preservation economics course, a preservation advocacy course. So there's a lot of different things that we end up teaching. And essentially, I thought it might be better than having just me come up here, blah, 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 about all the courses we have. I thought perhaps somebody who's actually endured them might be a better person to talk about, what is this really? Now, she's not going to talk about everything. I've asked her to talk about 3 to 6 of these different kinds of courses. But I'm going to have Rebecca come up now and basically talk about the different kinds of courses.
First, before we get into the courses that we have, one of the other main things that we have is the student organization on campus, because grad school is a little bit stressful sometimes, so it's nice to have a support group in place. And so we're really a threefold organization where we focus on learning, on service, and then also a little bit of social. So here we plan events where we go out to museums together. We have tea. We host a gala every year, which serves as our fundraiser so that we can then fund ongoing service opportunities. And then we also, every year we go and we help with state parks, where we help clean up, so Watson Mill Bridge. This past year, one of our students, he had worked at a historic farm before, so we went with him and did a trip down to discuss the landscape and the architecture and what's currently going on outside of Sparta, Georgia. We've also had students who help as docents with house museums for any sorts of tours that go on around the state. And then we also assist with Hands-On Athens, which is a coalition that is focused on helping lower income areas in the historic neighborhoods of Athens. So it helps us gain hands-on experience and while also giving back to the community. So some of the classes that we have, just going to go a little bit into depth so that the students who are watching and y'all kind of get a little bit of taste of what it's like for our coursework. So as Cari touched on, one of the first classes that we have is graphics, because it's really important that we understand how to present information visually the best way possible, whether it's through hand graphics, so here's an example of one of the houses that we have on campus, or whether it is in more advanced technologies on the computer like AutoCAD, SketchUp, or the Adobe suite through Photoshop or InDesign, which are really common nowadays in design studios. So it's great for us to have that introduction to those softwares, and then there are also other opportunities where we can take GIS classes, so Geographic Information Systems, which is a highly marketable program for us to be able to know nowadays. Another class is Cultural Resource Assessment, which Professor Gutches teaches, and this is really a wonderful class that is very project heavy based, where we do lots of small projects throughout the year that are focused on teaching us how to record different resources, whether it's vernacular or planned, going through deed offices if they're from the 1800s or the 1970s, and whether they're in good condition or poor condition, really taking us out into the field and making sure that we understand how to do these things, because we're not sure where we're going to be going for our job, so we have experience really working in the real world and understanding things. We also work on landscapes heavily, which is something that was new to a lot of us students, not recognizing that landscape is such an important feature for historic resources. And so we look at things either whether they're planned, like a college campus, or unplanned, like a agricultural area. We also do studies for cemeteries, which are really everywhere, and we've stumbled upon many that we weren't expecting to see. And so it's just another great experience for us to realize, how do you document this? How do you write it down and describe it so that people will actually have a grasp of it? Oh, and then also for this class, at the end, you work with a community, and for our class we went down to Eatonton in Putnam County, and we helped create a National Register nomination, which was a great experience to have, because it was a large undertaking, and we worked with the community, and we undertook original research, and we pulled all of those together and then presented them with something that if they want to, they can go forward and present it for a hopeful nomination later on. We have several architecture courses available. These are a few: American Architecture, World. Those two are mandatory to take, and then if students choose to later, they can also branch off and take vernacular and 20th century architecture, because there's really only so much that you can cover in the first two for a semester. And these are really a mix between traveling out to sites in and around Athens, because we're really fortunate to have such wonderful resources available that we can then use those to go out and have an architectural lab standing and go and touch the materials and interact with them, so we can learn about them on Monday and Wednesday, and then Friday go out to a site and really experience them. And so in this picture we actually also took a rather far field trip where we went up to Virginia at Poplar Forest, and we also did some travels into North Carolina. So it's really far reaching, and it's a great experience that we really enjoy. Another class is preservation law, which we take during our first semester, and it was very intimidating for me, because I was like, I did not go to law school for this reason. This is a bit terrifying for me. But the professor who teaches it is in charge of our program, and he's a preservation lawyer who has been participating in the field his entire career. And it's very approachable, and it's great for us to be able to have the understanding and kind of be able to think like a lawyer about why things are written a certain way, being able to read through legalese and different texts and court cases. And so for us to understand what the National Environmental Protection Act is, what paperwork you have to go through for certain things, what the National Historic Preservation Act is that, you know, our profession is based upon. So having a stronger understanding behind the constitutional basis of preservation is a really great thing that our program has, that I know a few others don't focus an entire course load on. So even though I was kind of terrified of it at first, I definitely am grateful that we have this as part of our curriculum. And then Professor Gutches touched upon this briefly, the building materials conservation course. This one is very hands-on, and we go through the identification process of different building materials, where we are tested on what time period they came from, how do you restore them, what do you do, where do you go, if you want to seek someone out to help restore a building, what are the appropriate ways that you remedy different things. And then at the end of the year, you produce a historic structures report, which is kind of like an autopsy for a building, where you go through the history and you propose solutions for any issues that there are. So these are a few pictures and a floor plan from an HSR that I worked on this past year at Callaway Plantation. So you produce to scale drawing plans for them, and then you go through, and here we have a sunken floorboard from foundational issues. bug issues. We have some rotted out bricks from rising damp because there are plants that are far too close and they had not been treated properly. And then also plaster issues of alligatoring, where the plaster had been applied directly to the brick had soaked through, and then these were the issues that we were having. So we produced a document about this thick with suggestions for the property so that then they can go hopefully and remedy them in the future. There are also opportunities available during the summer. So students can either do internships or participate in summer classes, or both depending on the schedule. This is just one of the classes that is available. It's a Maymester at Jekyll Island. That's been going on for the past 9 years continuously. And we're really fortunate because one of our alumni is actually the director of the Jekyll Island Authority there. So we're able to work closely with him, and during the week we do a combination of tours of the historic fabric of the Georgia coast, where we visit Cumberland Island, Sapelo, St. Simons, Brunswick, and Darien, in addition to spending a fair amount of time on Jekyll. And we also assist him with any of the projects that he's going on related to the houses that they take care of. Really, they're more like mansions. And so here are a few pictures of us doing work. It's a lot of window restoration. We took care of some rotting porches, so that involved sistering in beams, milling the wood, putting in bull noses, tongue and nose grooves to really fit with the historic fabric, using a hydraulic jack to lift up the floorboard of a foundation that had sunk in because the beams had shifted out of place over time, and then also installing telltales to be able to see what was going on with cracks and if they need to be monitored in the future. So it's a really great experience for us to have hands-on experience in a region that we're not necessarily familiar with because we've been doing so much work inland, to be able to see what the issues are that people at the coast deal with. And then another experience that is open to us is going to the conference for the National Trust, which is the main organization for historic preservation. And so it happens every year. This year we were fortunate enough for it to be in Chicago, which is an architectural textbook, and it was a great experience for us to be able to go and walk through and touch the buildings that we'd learned about. And so about half of our program, we had 14 students who were able to go, and we applied for a grant from the main foundation, which was able to help remedy some of the costs for travel and registration. And so during the 3-day event, it was a wonderful place for networking, taking classes, and going to meetings. So we try to go out there, represent the program well, and learn as much as we can about what preservation is going on around the country and all the new things that are happening. And then the last thing that I want to talk just to the students about is the thesis, because it's the last thing that we have to do before we graduate, because our program is thesis driven. And it is to show that you are able to find a topic and complete it on your own, and really go through and have a self-sufficient project that you can complete and show upon graduation. And so you have time dedicated in your course load to it. You're assigned a major professor who helps you travel through it. And it's wonderful because you can really choose anything that you're interested in, as long as you can drive it back to preservation, because as Cari said, so much, I mean, it's related to everything: intangible cultural heritage, physical, architecture. So here are just a few examples of thesis topics that are coming from my class. The Alpine influence on American Victorian architecture, so churches like that. Duck hunting camps in Louisiana and how they're related to the people who live there and how they use them. Cultural heritage landscape of Little Dixie in Missouri, a proposal for that. And then also an analysis of the Wren's Nest House Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. And so that's just really kind of the student perspective of things that are going on and the trajectory of what it is. And so
I'm hoping that you can see that obviously Rebecca did a much better job than I could have ever done about the kinds of experiences she had, and then she's still smiling and she still is very interested in her topic, so it's fantastic. Some of the other things that our program has done, like I said, when preservation started, it really was focusing on architecture and archaeology, and we've had to expand. So we do go back to the curriculum and we try to update as possible. One of the things that we did about 4 years ago was, you can tell that we really like to get out in the field and see things and experience things and expose the students to things. we basically decided to take 3 or 4 days off, and every year we would go to the coast. And one year we go to Savannah, the next year we go to Charleston. And the idea is that both years, the first year students and the second year students, are basically released from class. They all go together. They get to know not only the people in their class, but across classes, because really it's about networking and long-term networking. So we also go to both Savannah and Charleston because a lot of our alumni are there, and so they can actually see people do get jobs in historic preservation, and they get really interesting jobs in interesting places. So we will be going to Savannah the end of February, and we try to really expose the students to everything from high-style designed buildings to really very vernacular things. We look at Fort Pulaski, we look at Tybee Island, and we talk about even current day issues, sustainability, climate change. How does that have an impact on historic preservation? How do we apply technology to historic preservation? So all of the things that we know are happening in life, absolutely applicable. I just had the opportunity to give a presentation at a 3D digital documentation workshop in New Orleans, sponsored by the National Park Service. And so usually when you think historic preservation, the word technology doesn't always attach to historic preservation, but we have to. In this world that we live in, where everything is basically a sound bite and we're all checking Facebook and the students are looking at their smartphones a little bit too much, we need to connect in the way that people connect today. So we're trying to take advantage and show that all of these things absolutely integrate with the way we think about historic preservation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural landscapes, since that is my specialty. Essentially, cultural landscapes are anything manipulated by humankind over time. I'll repeat that. Anything manipulated by humankind over time. Usually what happens when I say that is people get this look on their face like, that's everything. And you're right, that is everything. However, of course, we put a layer of the National Register criteria over it, so 50 years old or older, and justifying why it might have significance in a certain way. So I always like to put these images up because we do think about parks, nice, lovely designed parks, whether it's Central Park or Piedmont Park. We think about lovely gardens or cemeteries. We think of vernacular farmsteads and our agricultural heritage. But it is things like our suburban subdivisions that is designed, that is planned, that is what society wants at that point in time. It is significant for different kinds of reasons. It's even the strip malls that we talk about. It's even dumps, landfills. Talk about cultural heritage. Oh my goodness. What can we learn through that? So we look at everything that is a cultural landscape, and I have the honor of being basically the director of a laboratory called the Cultural Landscape Laboratory. So I'll give you a little bit of background on that. Essentially, it started in about 2010, and the University of Georgia has been very, very fortunate that from about the 1970s to 2000, they had 4 or 5 different faculty that were both nationally and internationally known for kind of helping start the field of cultural landscapes and the way to think about cultural landscapes. They were very integral to how the National Park Service was defining what a cultural landscape was, what the process was for analyzing things like this. And so there's really been a very long institutional memory, essentially, at University of Georgia. When a lot of those folks were retiring around the 2000s, there was a choice that the College of Environmental Design could make about whether they would continue in that direction or not, and they chose to. So they started to hire some people. I was one of those hires during that time period. But we've created this laboratory for students and for faculty to work together on projects. So for example, I'm currently working on something called a Cultural Landscape Report. It's very similar to a Historic Structures Report that you look at all the details. I just happen to have a bigger scope, and I look at things in a little bit different way. I understand the environment. So I am currently looking at the cultural landscape of Fort Sumter. I'll let that sink in, because a lot of people would be, but that's a building, that's a fort. But you can't understand Fort Sumter if you don't understand the harbor, if you don't understand the channels, if you don't understand the viewshed connections as to why the battle occurred the way it did. So you have to understand the cultural landscape of that place. Similarly, we're looking at Cowpens National Battlefield, 800 acres. certainly strategy about where the swampland was, but we're not gonna go through the native river cane and the swamps if the road is perfectly clear. So you really start to see how the environment absolutely influences how history happens. So we also look at many different farmsteads and agricultural areas and the textile mill villages, if things like that, and we talk about what the history is, not just the social and the technological history, but literally the physical landscape change history. So cultural landscape has become a very important thing in the field of historic preservation over the past 25 or 30 years, and University of Georgia is actually one of maybe 2 programs in the entire country that has more than a 1-hour course on that, or 1-hour lecture. We literally have numerous different courses about what different aspects of cultural landscape. So, several of our students are from rural areas, so they're very interested when we have rural preservation courses. We also talk about how to document landscapes, similar how do you document architecture. There are certain ways to document landscapes, so we talk about that as well. So it really gives students an opportunity to be exposed to something that they wouldn't normally be exposed to. We also have a Center for Community Design and Preservation, and this is an organization that basically has different contracts with small towns, state agencies to do different kinds of preservation work. A lot of time it is architectural survey. They have a contract with the Georgia Transmission Corporation, where a lot of rural counties that may have, but probably haven't had, survey work done ever or a long time ago, look and see what kind of resources are there in historic counties or rural areas. So instead of just looking at the buildings, they're also looking at the landscapes and saying those are just as important. When DOT wants to widen roads, let's make sure that they're not widening them and ruining some kind of historic roadway or historic viewshed or some centennial farm, something like that. So this group has been able to, for quite a few years, document different counties in Georgia, and they typically will have some kind of historic resources survey report that they do.
Could you explain a little bit more that map?
Sure.
What the colors mean?
Sure. The program is called Find It, so they go out into rural counties and they literally look for historic resources. This particular graphic, basically each color is a different year. So starting in 2003 going up through 2017, they usually get a contract during the year to address a county. So they hire anywhere between 3 and 7 graduate students to literally road by road, side road by side road, go through and see what's there. They use aerial photography, but they literally go out into that place, drive around, eat bad food, get chased by dogs, all these different things. But they get that experience of trying to find what is out there that is 50 years old or older.
Is Morgan County one of those colors?
Yes. Yes.
2005.
Yep.
2005?
And of course, these do need to be updated. So periodically they are updated. So one of the things that's been interesting that Rebecca brought up is the architecture courses that she mentioned. Of course, we require American and world, but she also mentioned vernacular, because a lot of times we hadn't given credence as a preservation community. We haven't given credence to where do the concepts for vernacular architecture come from. She also talked about 20th century. So if you know anything about the National Register, you know that criteria is 50 years old or older. So I always joke and say, I am now potentially eligible for the National Register because I am over that time frame.
But are you significant?
Not at all. Not at all. I was just going to say, but it's the other criteria and the aspects you need to deal with, right? But what that means is ranch houses are to be determined. All of the brutalist architecture from the 60s and 70s. Even like I tell my students a lot now, the things that they're building now, all those town center suburban areas, in their lifetimes, those will be 50 years or older. They will meet that criteria, and they need to think about, were those representative of what society wanted at that point in time? How do we think about what's that continuum of historic preservation, and how do we understand things? So by giving the students the opportunity, they may come across a resource that they learned about in 20th century architecture. Oh, that's a really good example of this. Will that rural county appreciate that or value that to put it on the National Register? One never knows, but we at least have to acknowledge that it does exist and put it down in the list of potentially eligible things. So that's towns on projects for revitalization. In Athens, there long has been different mills and warehouses that have been defunct that could certainly be rehabilitated, and I know that Madison's really had quite a few successes with that as well. So essentially the students get involved with faculty to assist the local community, and so they have public participation, people that live right in that area or people that might have reuse ideas for that, all get together and talk about what could that thing become. So the students learn about planning, they learn about economics, and they're able to kind of pull all of that information together, okay? Yeah, so that is a very, very quick overview of what the University of Georgia Historic Preservation Program is, but if you have any questions, please feel free to ask either Rebecca or I. Yes?
How do you feel about, well, let's give you an example of a train depot becoming a restaurant, or a warehouse becoming an event place? Or,
Right.
Is that a good thing?
So adaptive reuse, basically.
Adaptive
The
reuse.
way we think about it in preservation is, it's really wonderful to have a historic building be intact, but if it's empty and you don't notice when that leak starts, or you don't notice when, excuse me, that electrical fire starts, then there's no point in having these kind of cavernous places if they're not actually being used. Think about all the energy and the building material that went into building those things. They're still around. They still are physically capable of being around. Why not use them?
Good.
They might have to be adapted because of new uses, but they can also be adapted in sensitive ways, allowing for handicap accessibility, allowing for different kinds of trendy new options coming in. And we teach about that. We teach about when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate, what kinds of things occur.
That's good.
So, what is the definition of vernacular architecture? I've never heard that term.
So, yeah, thank you for asking that. I'm going to say the general is anything that's not designed. So really it is, if you think about what is high design architecture, normally it was only the wealthiest of people who could afford an architect to actually then design that Palladian structure, et cetera. There were an awful lot of really great contractors and builders that understood those principles, and so you could kind of say that those things were designed as well. But if someone is immigrating from Scandinavia and they land in upper Midwest, there's different materials. They know how things were built in their homeland, but they may not have the same materials. So they may be going from a highly forested area to an area that's entirely prairie. So the whole idea of like sod houses, they know they need openings for windows, they need doors, they need coverage, this and that. So it's a way of something that you've always known in your mind culturally. How do you adapt it and create it in a new place? But it isn't high design typically. So it's just a kind of common sense know-how. I need to build barns. Okay, how do I build barns? I need to build a house to live in. I'm not wealthy, so I'm not going to build that Greek Revival house. I'm going to build a one-story wood frame house. I know how to do wood frame. Okay, I'll do what I can do. So it really is a non-designed, but really that's the history of the United States. 99% of what we have is vernacular. And unfortunately, whether it's actually a vernacular landscape, all those farmsteads you pass every day that suddenly they become a parking lot for some development. You don't typically appreciate vernacular things kind of until they're almost gone, but they tell the story of America. They tell the story of history. So that's one of the reasons that we choose to teach about that. Yeah.
And if any of you forget that explanation, if you go to the bicentennial plaque in front of the Richter College, it's about vernacular
Vernacular
architecture.
architecture, yeah.
That's where I learned that word.
Is it?
Yes.
Yes, you have a number of different programs, but are your graduates tending to go into one area or another? Is there some sort of large demand now for one discipline versus another?
They go into different kinds of agencies and different groups. The kind of typical places that one can get can use their preservation degree and get a job really varies, and it's really up to the student as to what they're interested in. Nonprofit organizations, the friends of groups for historic societies and things like that, they need people who have that expertise, so they certainly get jobs there. Local governments, state governments, federal governments, because there are requirements about if funding is going to be used to change roads, buildings, whatever, they need experts who can assist with that process. A lot of times, park and recreation departments even, if they have very old resources, that might be CCC resources, they also need people who do that kind of work. So there's actually a lot of planning offices, there's a lot of different groups that offer opportunities for the students. So it really is what they are interested in. Because some students really don't have an interest in working for any kind of government, and so they want to go to the nonprofit world, and they really want to give back that way. Some people realize how difficult it is to work in a nonprofit environment, and they're very interested in helping their local community in some way. And so they might be more interested in local government. But there's quite a few different kinds of positions out in the world now.
Actually, Madison's a pretty good
Example of a lot of
microcosm.
things.
3 people in our planning department have gone through a preservation program, let's say, because some of them are ABT. One of the planners over at the county is from UGA. One of our local private landscapers has an MLA with a certificate in preservation. And Christine McCauley, who is the director of the Madison Morgan Conservancy, has a degree in preservation. So,
So you find people in a lot of different arenas, and even we've had some people in preservation and in landscape architecture that have even been, I shouldn't even bring this up, that have been in Congress at an earlier time. I won't bring it up now, sorry. Other questions or comments?
This might be on the side, but in your historic preservation program, what kind of research are you able to do, or do you try to do to find who the actual builders of all these old buildings we love are? Now, they weren't all certified architects, that's for
Right,
sure, but
right.
they were builders, they were, from Thomas Jefferson on down, he didn't have an architecture degree, but he managed to not.
Right, so that's basically called people who are studied, you know, they
Right.
educate, self-education about what
Do you
the.
develop-
Many of our students over the years, as they choose thesis topics, have become interested in different cities or areas of Georgia that may have had a locally famous architect or a very good contractor, but no one's actually written about them
Right.
or studied them. So we've actually had quite a few people who've chosen to work. Macon was quite the hotbed of architecture and contracting development at an earlier time, that have been able to actually help the history of that place by doing their thesis work on particular people. But we also, in the cultural resource assessment class and a few others, research is always the foundation of everything that we do. Nothing is about making it up. We have to have proof, and that's basically the justification with the National Register, et cetera. We're never going to just kind of construct something because we think it's interesting. There's got to be proof either through social means or physical evidence or, honestly, observation skills of understanding how buildings and landscapes work and kind of deducing what was happening during that period of time, what kind of access to materials might people have had to that time. So we look at newspapers just to see what are the nurseries selling during that period of time, what are the stores selling, what's available. We look through if it's a wealthy owner of a house and they have kept great records, hopefully. We certainly look through all of that. So we see what their connections and networks are. But research ends up being very much a baseline for our students so they understand nothing is a speculation.
Rebecca, I noticed that in the list of feces up there, one was the wren's nest. Do you know who is working on that and why?
We have picked a good one to ask about. Yeah, that's my thesis topic. So actually, I got interested in it in one of our early classes that we take in the first semester. It is on principles and practices, where you go through and learn about just the history of preservation in America. And so our task was to find an institution and follow its history through. And so while I was doing the basic research, I found out that there were lots of holes in the story, and that it was a very interesting topic because the group that had owned it up until the 1970s were discriminating against African Americans and not letting them in, way past the Civil Rights Act. So it had a very troubled history, and even though they have become an amazing institution now and have opened their doors when they changed to a current nonprofit group in 1984, that there's still a lot of issues within the community because the West End, where it's located, is a very tight-knit group, and so there's still, rightfully so, people feel that it is the racist museum in town. And so I really
guess
wanted...
no support from the Atlanta municipal government.
Right, and the government stopped funding them because they were going against the national legislation by not letting people enter it. And so I really wanted to go through and put together a full institutional history, which had been lacking for the museum because it is the oldest house museum in all of Atlanta. It has all the original furniture, it has all these accolades going for it, but nobody knows about it, nobody visits it. And so just what are the issues that are going, how can they be fixed, and then what is the role that the Wren's Nest can be in Atlanta in the 21st century as the Beltline is expanding and Atlanta is changing. What is the role of it? It is the one in the bottom corner there. So it's the full of Joel Chandler Harris, author of the Uncle Remus stories, Uncle Remus Library.
Yes.
And so this was his home in Atlanta that he lived in from 1884 until his death in 1906, and where he wrote all of the stories.
One of the other topics that one student is doing, and I happen to be working with her, but she has Cajun heritage, and she's been going to duck hunting camps forever in Louisiana, and she just kind of thought, gosh, I wonder if those things could be listed on the National Register, like what are they and stuff. And so because she's so proud of her Cajun heritage, we said, well, let's look into this, let's see what this is. So she's really had a fantastic time speaking with her grandfather and grandfather's friends in different kinds of duck hunting camps. And it deals with the environment. So it is a cultural landscape. It is an environment that, of course, is going to be influenced by climate change, sustainability. As you can imagine, a lot of these camps are kind of, if there's been storms and things, of course you take off what's been ruined and you put on new layers and this and that. How do you deal with that in historic preservation? So it makes it a very interesting and complex. So we really are very open to whatever the student is interested in, as well as these are resources that we actually do need to think about into the future as historic resources because they tell everyone's story. Well, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much.